I can never forget that day. The letter was waiting for me when I got home. Certified 6 figures, no warning, just fines already starting to compound. They said I'd crossed into association-controlled land, violated setback rules, obstructed the greenbelt, but I hadn't built anything, hadn't moved a fence. So I pulled out the deed, then the plat, then the county filings. The overlay they enforced didn't match the record. There was no deed transferring that strip to the HOA. Maintenance doesn't equal ownership. They couldn't pressure me. They escalated. Pre-line notice, community memo, deadlines tightening. So I hired a surveyor, 3.7 feet inside my boundary, certified, stamped, entered into the record. The fines were withdrawn, not reduced, not adjusted, just removed, because authority without conveyance doesn't hold, and boundaries set in steel don't move for pressure. Then when I came back from town, the letter was waiting again. No flashing lights, no raised voices, just a stiff, oversized envelope leaning against the doorframe, half shadowed by the late afternoon sun. Certified mail, my name typed cleanly across the front. Correct spelling, correct address. I stood there longer than necessary, keys still in my hand, listening to the silence of the street. The trees along the sidewalk were evenly spaced, trimmed to the same height. Lawns, neatly cut driveways, empty, everything orderly, everything controlled. I picked up the envelope and took it inside. It landed on the kitchen counter with a dull weight, heavier than a reminder, heavier than something routine. I washed my hands before opening it, not out of ritual, just to slow the moment down. When I broke the seal, the first page slid out stiff and official. My eyes didn't go to the header. They went to the number 6 figures. I read it twice, then a third time. No misplaced decimal, no clerical slip. The fines were itemized in neat columns, violation codes, dates, accrued penalties, interest already calculated, already compounding, as if the outcome had been decided long before I was notified. I forced myself to start at the top. It identified the HOA, the Enforcement Committee, and the sections of the CC and RS under which action had been taken. Then the violations: setback, encroachment, easement, obstruction, unauthorized use of restricted land, each one described with quiet certainty. Each one tied to provisions I remembered reviewing during closing but never expecting them to be deployed like this. I read slowly. I hadn't built anything new, hadn't moved a fence, hadn't altered the slope of the yard or blocked access to anything. The physical memory of the property didn't match what was written on the page. I flipped to the signature. Karen Hay, President. Her name was printed, not signed. Typed authority under formal letterhead. The tone of the notice was measured, almost reassuring, routine enforcement, standard procedure, not personal. That phrase stuck with me. When something truly is impersonal, it rarely needs clarification. I carried the pages to the dining table and laid them flat. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint rhythm of a sprinkler somewhere down the street. I tried to visualize the violations. The gravel drive, the fence line, the leaning tree near the corner, the slope toward the road. Nothing crossed a boundary in my mind. Nothing intruded on shared space. The discrepancy felt less emotional than geometric. I went to the filing cabinet and pulled out my closing documents, the deed, the survey, the disclosures. I hadn't looked at them since the day I signed. I spread them beside the HOA notice. On one side, the accusations. On the other, the property I purchased. The legal description on my deed was dense but precise. Bearings, distances, reference markers tied to fixed points. It described a shape I recognized because I'd walked it, because I lived inside it. The notice referenced association-controlled land repeatedly but never defined it. The phrase appeared as fact, not explanation. I read the fine schedule again. The violations had been accruing for months. No prior letters, no warnings, just accumulation. The first contact wasn't corrective, it was financial. My instinct was to call and resolve it, find the misunderstanding, close the loop. I picked up my phone, then set it back down. The structure of the letter bothered me. It moved directly to penalties without documenting prior engagement. It assumed authority rather than establishing it. I turned to the final page. Payment methods were detailed deadlines, clearly outlined consequences listed in sequence. There was more clarity about how to pay than about what I had done. That was when doubt settled in. Not anger, not fear, doubt. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room. The house felt steady, built within lines that made sense to me. Outside, the sun was lowering, stretching long shadows across the lawn. The same lawn now described as misused. I thought about the walkthrough before closing. The agent gesturing casually to the boundaries. References to HOA land spoken as if the phrase carried inherent authority. No one had shown me a deed for it. I read the notice once more. Authority was asserted, not demonstrated. Violations were listed, not illustrated. Fines were calculated, not contextualized. I folded the pages carefully and slid them back into the envelope. For the first time since moving in, the HOA felt less like an abstract entity and more like a mechanism with direction. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a process already in motion. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Every house sat in quiet compliance, maintained predictable. I wondered how many of them assumed the boundaries beneath their feet had been verified beyond habit. The thought didn't unsettle me. It focused me. I didn't respond that night. I took a legal pad and wrote a single sentence at the top, verify, before reacting. Then I listed each claim from the letter, leaving space beneath them for answers I didn't yet have. The fines were real. The pressure was real, but the foundation behind them needed measurement. I turned off the lights and went to bed with the envelope still on the table. This wasn't the beginning of a fight. It was the beginning of a review. The next morning I cleared the table. Not just the coffee cup or the envelope from the night before. Everything. I needed a clean surface to lay out what mattered. The deed, the survey, the title policy, the plat from closing. I pulled the manila envelope from the back of a drawer. The flap was soft from having been opened once and then ignored. At the time, I thought signing meant certainty. That once the ink dried, the boundaries stopped moving. Now I wasn't so sure. I laid the deed down first. Legal size, paper, dense language bearings, and distances tied to fixed reference points. No commentary, no interpretation, just description. Then the seller disclosures, utility easements, drainage acknowledgments, standard paperwork. Finally, the plat map. At first glance, it looked clean. Lots arranged in blocks, streets running parallel, areas shaded in gray and labeled common. It was the kind of diagram meant to reassure buyers that someone had already thought through the layout. I followed the line slowly with my finger. Lot numbers staggered slightly near the eastern edge. A corner angled differently than the rest. A gray strip intersected two parcels but carried no separate parcel number of its own. It wasn't chaos. It was assumption drawn in ink. I turned the page over. No legal description for the shaded areas. No meets and bounds for the green belts, just labels. I opened my laptop and pulled up the digital copy of my title policy. I searched for association-owned land. Nothing. Then Common Area 1 reference as designated by applicable CC and RS. No deed attached, no conveyance document, just a cross-reference to another document. I moved to the county recorder website and searched my parcel number first. The listing came up clean. Owner name, legal description, filing history. Then I searched the adjacent parcels, then the strips marked in gray on the plat, the areas labeled as Greenbelt. Each search took time. The system wasn't fast, but it was precise. One by one, I opened the histories. Original subdivision filing replats when streets were adjusted, easements granted for drainage or utilities. What I didn't find was as important as what I did. There was no deed transferring the gray-labeled strips from the developer to the HOA. No separate parcel registered in the HOA's name for the green belt running behind my lot. There were maintenance agreements, notations granting the association the right to care for certain areas, but no fee title. They mowed the grass. They maintained the benches. They collected dues. Nowhere did it say they owned the land beneath those actions. I leaned back and reread the phrase from Karen's letter. Association-controlled land. Controlled was not conveyed. I pulled up the CC and RS next. The document was long, written in a way that layered definitions over references. I searched for common area. The term appeared dozens of times, but most of the language relied on circular phrasing. Common areas as identified in the final recorded plat. Land recognized by the association as communal, recognized, identified, managed. None of those words equaled transferred. I began listing every section that referenced land ownership without attaching a deed or legal description. The list grew quickly. The structure became clear. The CC and RS referenced the plat. The plat labeled gray space is common. The gray space had no recorded conveyance. Each document pointed to the next. None anchored the title. Around noon, an email arrived from Karen. "Mr. Cole," it began. She referenced my continued non-compliance and attached an updated ledger. Additional penalties had been assessed. The total had increased. Near the end of the message, one paragraph stood out. "Please understand that continued refusal to bring your property into compliance places the association at risk of unnecessary legal expense, which we are prepared to recover under Section 12 of the CC&RS. The escalation was subtle, from fines to legal exposure, from correction to consequence. I didn't reply. Instead, I stepped outside. The midday sun was direct. The gravel at the edge of the drive reflected heat upward. I walked along the side yard where the setback violation had been listed. The fence stood where it had stood since before I bought the house. The easement marker near the corner remained undisturbed. I walked to the rear boundary and looked across the open strip. The HOA called it the Greenbelt. No signage, no separate parcel markers, no posted boundaries, just maintained grass and the assumption that it belonged to someone else. I stood there and tried to separate habit from record. The neighborhood treated the strip as common. The county records did not. Back inside, I returned to the CC&RS. I read the enforcement section again. Most clauses reference the association's authority over property subject to this declaration, but the declaration never attached a deed for the gray-labeled strips. Authority was assumed to extend as far as the overlay map showed. The overlay map itself was not recorded as a transfer of title. By late afternoon, the pattern had hardened. The HOA's authority rested on layered references and long-standing practice. The deed rested on bearings and coordinates. One was habitual, the other was measurable. I opened a new document and began drafting questions, not accusations. Questions. Please provide the recorded deed conveying the Greenbelt parcel to the Ridgeway HOA. Please confirm the filing date and instrument number of any title transfer referenced in enforcement notices. Please clarify the legal description for association-controlled land cited in violation letters. I saved the document but did not send it. At the top of the page, I wrote "confirm" before responding. The pressure from the fines was real. Numbers on the ledger had weight, but numbers derived from incorrect boundaries would not hold. As the sun lowered, I spread the deed and the plat side by side once more. The shape described in my deed was precise. The shape implied by the HOA's language was broader. And between those two shapes sat the question that mattered. Where does record end and assumption begin? I closed the laptop and gathered the documents into a stack. Karen was repeating rules that had likely gone unchallenged for years. I wasn't looking to dismantle anything. I was looking for the deed, and until I saw it, I wasn't prepared to accept that the lines on her map overrode the lines on mine. The third letter arrived before I had finished reviewing the second. Same envelope, same formatting, this one thicker. Inside were inspection reports I hadn't requested and hadn't known were happening. Dates, violation codes, photographs taken from angles that felt deliberate, wide enough to imply context, narrow enough to avoid measurement. No prior notice, no conversation, just documentation. I laid the new letter beside the others on the table and aligned the dates. The timeline was tightening. Fines had increased. Interest had compounded. Each notice referenced the previous one as if it had already been acknowledged, as if silence meant agreement. But I hadn't agreed to anything. These weren't attempts to resolve an issue. They were steps in a process already in motion. The language leaned heavily on sections of the CC&RS 4.2, B 9.1.3, 12. Each reference stacked on top of the last, reinforcing the idea that the structure was complete and unquestionable. Still no response to my inquiries about recorded conveyance. Still no document showing ownership of the land in dispute, just more enforcement. I began keeping a formal log, not notes entries. Date, time, received documents, attached changes, and total balance. March 11th, 8:43 a.m. Third notice received 3 violations, reiterated penalties, revised photos attached. I saved digital copies, printed duplicates, cross-referenced dates with the county filings I had pulled. Then I marked the deadlines on a wall calendar. 10 days to remit payment, 5 days to cure the violation, 7 days to appeal. Each timeline overlapped the others. It was structured to compress response time while the numbers grew. Pressure doesn't need to be loud. It needs to be sequential. 2 mornings later, I saw them. 2 HOA volunteers walking along the outer edge of my property. Clipboards in hand. They stayed outside the fence line but paused frequently, gesturing toward the slope near the drainage, the section of fence cited in the violation. They didn't knock. They didn't look toward the house. They documented and moved on. I watched from the upstairs window. There was nothing dramatic about it. No shouting, no confrontation, just procedure. That afternoon, another email from Karen. Mr. Cole, it began. Our enforcement team has completed its latest review. Continued refusal to comply will result in formal lien proceedings under our charter. The revised total $128,400. I read the number slowly. The escalation wasn't emotional. It was administrative. From notice to revised notice to pre-lien reference. The structure was predictable now. Enforce increase, imply consequence. I called the county for clarification on buffer zones and rights of way. The municipal engineer I reached spoke plainly. If there's no recorded transfer, he said, ownership doesn't change, maintenance doesn't equal title. What if it's been treated as common land for years, I asked. That happens, he replied, until someone checks. I logged the call. Later that evening, a neighbor slowed near the driveway while I was coiling a hose. You doing okay? He asked carefully. Sorting through paperwork, I said. He hesitated. They said you're blocking greenbelt access. Did they show you a deed, I asked? He frowned slightly. No, just the notice. He nodded once and walked on. That was how pressure spread here, not through argument, through repetition. The phrase greenbelt violation had already circulated before the boundary had been verified. Back inside, I reviewed the CC and RS again, this time focusing only on enforcement authority. The document assumed jurisdiction over common areas. It did not attach a legal description of those areas. Policy referenced map. Map referenced policy. Neither cited a deed number. Karen's letters treated jurisdiction as settled. Fact but fact, and enforcement requires record. I received notice of a board meeting 3 days later. Agenda item: enforcement proceedings for non-responsive homeowners. The phrasing was general. The implication wasn't. I marked the date on the calendar and added 2 additional entries beneath it. Confirm survey certification timeline. Consult land use attorney if necessary. I wasn't escalating. I was aligning. Outside, the wind moved through the trees the same way it had the afternoon the first envelope appeared. Nothing about the land had changed, but the mechanism surrounding it had become clearer. The HOA's process was built to advance and be less interrupted. Letters, deadlines, escalation. The expectation wasn't discussion, it was compliance. I updated the log again that night. 4th notice anticipated within 5 days. Balance increasing on a scheduled interval. No documentation provided to establish land conveyance. Then I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. Pressure operates on fatigue. It counts on response before verification. But if I move too quickly, the discussion would shift from record to argument, and argument favors volume. Record favors patience. The fines were increasing. The language was tightening. The timeline was compressing. But the underlying question hadn't changed. Who owns the land they are enforcing? Until that question was answered with a recorded instrument number, not a memo, the pressure remained procedural, not decisive. And procedure, unlike title, can be paused. The county office was quiet when I arrived. Old carpet, fluorescent lighting, a front desk separated from the records terminal room by a half wall, and a door that stayed locked unless someone asked. I signed in and waited while the clerk unlocked the computer room. I didn't need assistance, I needed access. The monitor took a moment to wake. I entered my parcel number and opened the filing history. Owner name, legal description, tax status. Then I moved backward. Original subdivision plat, subsequent replats, easement adjustments, minor lot line corrections. I downloaded each document and saved them in chronological order, not for argument, for sequence. Then I searched for the HOA. No dedicated parcel under its name for the greenbelt strips. No recorded deed transferring the gray-labeled areas from the developer to the association. What appeared instead were notations designated common use, maintenance responsibility assigned, not subject to individual title use rights, not ownership. I printed the original subdivision plat and laid it beside the version Karen had included in her enforcement packet. At first glance they looked similar, but the differences were there. The HOA overlays showed thicker boundary lines, cleaned up angles, adjusted setback markings. Some corners appeared slightly squared compared to the recorded version, not dramatically altered, just enough to shift perception. I measured distances against the legend scale. On my eastern boundary, the overlay trimmed several feet from the original line, not enough to attract immediate suspicion, enough to place my fence inside what the overlay labeled as common buffer. The violation notice cited that exact section. I sat back and studied both maps again. The county version was dated, stamped, and recorded. The HOA overlay was formatted and circulated. Only one carried an instrument number. I returned to the terminal and searched the parent tract, the land the subdivision had originally been carved from. The 1993 filing described the entire ridge as a single tract.